This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
It's already time to preview spring football, if you can believe it. Next on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Tip. Caught.
They said you can't beat Ohio State. Now what?
Brady gets terrific. Throws it. And a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Second. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace. Welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. And that's right, spring football is already underway for the Michigan Wolverines. They have tended to like to get started on this earlier than normal under Jim Harbaugh, but the last couple of years, they've started in February, taken a break for spring break, and then come back to wrap things up again in March. So spring football is already underway, which means it's a great time to start looking ahead to the 2023 football season. And a lot of times, the identity, culture, the character of your team is really forged in the spring. Fall is about preparation for the season. Spring is about formation for the season, inwardly, internally. And so to that end, here are the 5 areas that I am most paying attention to for spring practice storylines. And number 5 starts with what I just mentioned, the culture transformation that has taken place at Michigan. And you have to give Jim Harbaugh credit for this, maybe more than anything else. The recognition that whatever they were doing at Michigan wasn't working. They were winning a lot of games, not a lot of meaningful games, and then the bottom completely fell out in the COVID year of 2020. It was clear the culture needed a complete reboot. And then you wondered, when leaders like Aiden Hutchinson moved on, when leaders like Cade McNamara transferred out, or last year got hurt, and so really couldn't play any meaningful snaps, would that culture remain? We saw last year that indeed it would. And so now, does it stay a third year? Another layer of leaders like Mike Morris and Mozzie Smith have now moved on to the NFL. Are guys like J.J. McCarthy ready to fully step in and assume that role? We know guys like Blake Corum are. But that's really, to me, the first and I think biggest question of this entire ordeal, because on paper, when we just look at personnel, this is the best team that Jim Harbaugh has had yet, and one of the best teams going into a season that Michigan has had in recent memory. So let's get into some of those personnel questions with the rest of our topics. Number 4, who's the third running back? I mean, guys, there's been a lot of years around here recently where we were just wondering who's the star running back heading into spring football. But it just goes to show what I just said a minute ago about how set up this roster is to compete for a national championship, that one of the biggest conversations we're going to be having this spring is who's the third running back I mean, after, Blake Corum, one of the best running backs in Michigan history, Donovan Edwards, one of the most explosive running backs in recent Michigan history. When those guys need a blow, who comes in next? Is it Khalil Mullings, who got a lot of minutes at the end of last year? CJ Stokes, who got a lot of minutes at the beginning of last year? Is it somebody else? But since we don't expect to see any of Corum and very little of Donovan Edwards this spring, this is going to be an opportunity for one of those guys, or maybe a Tavi Dunlap or somebody else, to truly step forward as the number 3 running back on this team. And given the amount of times Michigan likes to run the football under Jim Harbaugh, there's a decent number of carries there for somebody that wants to assume that mantle. Number 3, which young wide receivers are ready to step up? We know guys like Roman Wilson are big play receivers ready to happen. Cornelius Johnson, for all the talk of him being more of a possession guy, he's got one of the longest receptions and touchdown receptions in Michigan history. He blew up Ohio State for a couple of big plays last year. He's back. So now we're really talking about some of the new guys, highly recruited players like Tyler Morris, Darius Clemens. At least one of those guys are going to need to step up to take the place of Ronnie Bell in this year's receiving corps. Whom will it be? Maybe, given how highly recruited those guys were, it'll be all of them. And don't sleep on Christian Dixon as well. He was a big-time recruit out of California 3 years ago. Number 2 on this list, I should say. How do we handle the depth and competition along the offensive line? Folks, go back and watch our spring football questions 4 or 5 years ago. They were a little bit different than these. They were more like, can we get to 8 offensive linemen? This year, it is possible. Now, the Arizona State transfer that was penciled in to start at left tackle, he's not in school yet. So that's going to give Jeffrey Percy or Trente Jones or Carson Barnhart the opportunity to be that left tackle. And Jones and or Barnhart will probably be the right tackle in that battle. But when he gets into school, I mean, you're talking about Michigan with an offensive line that's like a hockey line. 2 full complement of 5-person offensive lines that the backup line would be one of the best in the Big Ten. So, I mean, this is the kind of stuff for those of you that are my age or older. You remember when Michigan had this kind of depth. It's been a minute since even when the Wolverines have had some good teams, had this kind of this kind of depth. It's an embarrassment of riches along the offensive line. And again, that's something that Sharon Moore and Jim Harbaugh deserve a lot of credit. I was one of those that questioned the move of a pretty good offensive line coach in order to replace him with Sharon Moore, who'd never coached the position before. But in terms of recruiting and development, it has worked out masterfully. And the number 1 storyline to be watching, I think, this spring, apologies there, I think I misspelled his name, Amarion Walker's move to corner. That's the biggest personnel question on this team heading into next fall. Who is the second corner on the team? That's it. I mean, where else do you see a personnel question on this team? Maybe backup quarterback, but we've seen Davis Warren play a lot, I think he'd at least be capable. And not a lot of great college football programs have 2 good quarterbacks these days anyway, because the kid that's not the starter tends to transfer out. So, okay, backup quarterback, maybe. Offensive line, we were just talking about. It's loaded. Running back, we're talking about who the third guy is. They're talking like the defensive line might be better than it was last year. Linebacker. Now you're bringing in an Ernest Hausman. You're getting back into Kai Hill Green. So you're adding him to the guys that you're bringing back from last year, which is pretty much that entire unit. What's left? There's one real battle for significant playing time on this entire roster of 22 positions. And it is the cornerback position opposite of Will Johnson. And Amarion Walker, who was originally slated to be a wide receiver and has that kind of size, he's made the move to corner full time. If he's got the agility in space with the speed and length that he provides, I mean, you're talking Tariq Woolen kind of stuff that the Seattle Seahawks, when they drafted him out of UTSA. Michigan is hoping he can eventually develop into that kind of player, and all eyes will be on him to see if it happens this spring because, again, there really aren't a lot of personnel question marks on this team heading into this season. A lot of known commodities, guys that have played a lot of big-time football on the biggest stages and performed very well, which is why I think Michigan's going to be rated no lower than number 2 when the preseason polls come out later on this summer. Well, let's find out what our one and only reasonable Bucknut fan happens to think about Michigan's big questions heading into the spring, and maybe we're a little too doped up on the hype? We'll find out with Mark Rogers when we come back. Well, let's get a view from the scarlet and gray side of the septic tank with our good friend Mark Rogers, who has a fantastic channel of his own right here on YouTube, the voice of college football. So much great information across the great landscape of the greatest of sports. Good to see you again, Mark, who also moonlights as a reasonable yet bucknut nevertheless. Good to see you, brother. How are you?
Good to see you, Steve. While the rest of you are diving into March Madness, us college football nerds are digging through spring practice rosters and the like.
Indeed. And I was just going through what I thought were the major storylines on my end from a Michigan perspective. I've never had a spring football preview quite like this, Mark. I mean, maybe this is what it's been like for you guys on your side of the street here for the last, 15, 20 years. But we basically have two questions. Who's the number 2 corner? Who's the number 3 running back? And I guess you could throw in which of the 11 deep offensive line, which of those 5 guys will start? I mean, I guess, we'll miss Jake Moody, of course, maybe the greatest kicker in Michigan history, but they recruited a top flight kid to replace him who's been waiting 2 years for his opportunity. I mean, I kind of had to reach to come up with 5 storylines to follow this spring, and they included who's the number 3 running back and which 5 of the 11 deep offensive line will play. I just don't recall, at least, not since we started doing this stuff, Michigan having a spring like this. This looks like something in the late 90s.
Feeling pretty good about yourself.
Well, you tell me. Okay. Am I missing something? Is there some great concern out there that I didn't touch on other than the ones I just referenced? Am I missing something?
Great concerns? No. Okay, let's go to the running back position, because as long as the 2 studs, Jonathan Edwards and Blake Corum, are healthy, then there's no need for a number 3 guy, because he's going to be carrying the football with a 4-touchdown lead. But of course, Blake Corum is missing the spring. Maybe that's more serious than we believe it to be, and could carry. Hopefully not. I want everyone to be healthy, but it could carry into the fall. Jonathan Edwards obviously missed time to start out 22. So if you don't have one of those guys, then that number 3 guy becomes the number 2 guy, and then that becomes a bit of a critical situation. The pass rush, from going back to the games against Ohio State, TCU, Illinois, some of the games that were a bit closer, seem to wane in those games, despite it being a strong point of the team for a second consecutive year. Mike Morris, Ozzie Smith, those guys are gone. Yabi Anoma, he's off to his next stop, Charlotte. Why, I don't know. But, I do know that there's a connection there, yes. So anyway, I know that they've got capable guys coming back, but they really haven't been a force. McGregor, Jalen Harrell, had a sack in the Big Ten championship game. So they have some components there. Josiah Stewart was a really nice pickup from Coach Carolina. But the pass rush to maintain its effectiveness over the last 2 years, some questions are going to have to be answered there. And I guess my other point with the offensive line, because, there's a lot of reinforcements. There's depth, and that's extremely important in the offensive front. But I don't know if they place the quality of a Matt Hayes or an Olu Olatimi with, again, a lot of guys that have a ton of experience, not just on campus, a lot of playing time on the field. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think the pass rush is a point that, but we had this exact conversation last year. I told you we'd have more sacks this year than last year, and everybody told me I was nuts. That turned out to actually be true. If you go back and look at our pass rush the last month of the season, the guys that did the most, had the most consistent job applying pressure, Yabi Anoma kind of fell apart, just disappeared in November of last year. Braden McGregor really came on. He might have been the most consistent pass rusher we had. He's coming back. Josiah Stewart's a guy that a lot of us think has an NFL future, so he's basically taking the Yabi Anoma spot. Derek Moore was one of the top edge rushers in high school 2 years ago, and we got him coming off a decommitment to Oklahoma to come here. So, I mean, there's bodies there for sure, and so I'm not especially with the way Michigan plays defense, I'm not, and against Ohio State, which is basically don't give up any big plays. We're not getting caught in some blitzes. We're going to keep everything in front of us, make them drive the length of the field, stay patient. That's worked the last 2 years in a row. I would be very surprised if Michigan is not in a third straight college football playoff because the pass rush didn't live up to its billing, given the talent that they have there. I would be surprised at that. The offensive line points you make is an interesting one, that there isn't maybe a leader there. I would argue Zach Zinter might be the best guard returning in college football, but it's kind of hard for a guard to be a star, unless it's like Quentin Nelson at Notre Dame or something like that, So I'm with you. I sense, I can see your point where that is concerned too, but I would say overall, though, I much rather would be trying to answer these questions in a spring compared to the kinds of existential questions Michigan has had to answer in many of the previous ones.
Yeah, I do think that Harbaugh has got this program in a place, and not just from a personnel standpoint, but I know that you've addressed culture. And I don't know that there's a football program in America beyond Nick Saban and what he's established there. Kirby Smith now at Georgia and Dabo Swinney at Clemson, even though they've fallen off. But that is attached and identified with the coach as much as Michigan. And this is maybe where being a Michigan man actually means something, because Jim Harbaugh's weathered a lot of storms, some that he's created, and got this program in place where we've seen other programs and other coaches elevate programs temporarily, season or two. And I'm not thinking of championship level, just at any degree based on the expectations, but then there's a fall off at some point because they don't maintain it. Well, I believe Jim Harbaugh, he's got a fascination with the NFL. And I understand that. And it's legit. It's valid. Being a Michigan man, I think he just cares more about the situation than, about that much more than just about any other coach in the country, and to give him motivation to keep this together. And I truly believe what he says about, hey, this is my job, this is my team, and he talks in glowing terms of who he is, and it's the greatest place to be, and who has it better than us. So I believe all things to a certain extent. Not that you can't be drawn in other directions, but I think this particular team should be in a good place. Now, I'm going to separate culture from chemistry, because chemistry is unique to every specific team.
That's a good distinction. Yeah.
We don't know what that's going to be and how good it's going to be, but we've got indication that it should be good because there's just so many guys coming back. But the good thing about this team is they've achieved so much to have confidence. So that's built tremendous confidence, but they haven't won it all. So there should still be confidence. And when you match the confidence with the hunger, that's a dangerous situation for everyone else in the Big Ten.
Speaking of the Big Ten, let's have a broader conversation about the league. In my opinion, Mark, the biggest storyline in our league this spring is Drew Aller at Penn State. When you look at what they have coming back, if he can at least play to the level that Sean Clifford finished his career at, which is an okay, not great, but, serviceable, consistent starting quarterback in the Big Ten, with what else they bring back, I mean, I think you could be looking at both at the start and the end of the year, 3 teams in the Big Ten East, all in the top 5, all on that top 6 board for a college football playoff bid. But I think it really comes down to how much is he ready to step into that void. And I think unlike what we saw with J.J. McCarthy, we saw Drew Aller a little bit last year, but it was like almost all in mop-up time. We saw J.J. McCarthy play when games were in contention and still in dispute. Now, we didn't see C.J. Stroud at all, okay, and that worked out pretty good for him. I'm not concerned at all about the Ohio State quarterback situation. Both Kyle McCord and is it Devin Brown is the other player. Both of them were very highly recruited. They're going to take over maybe the best receiving unit in the conference, if not the country. Again, the last 3 Ohio State quarterbacks had different profiles, one that couldn't run, one that loved to run, and one that wouldn't run. And all 3 of them all were first-round draft picks in the NFL. So I think that they're going to be okay there. To me, I think Drew Aller and how quickly can he assert himself as an alpha under center for Penn State is the biggest issue, I think, and question and storyline in our league this spring.
Well, for the first time since James Franklin's been there, they have raised the ceiling of the quarterback position to the level of Ohio State and what Michigan now has with J.J. McCarthy. Drew Aller came into the opener on the road against Purdue when the game was competitive all the way through. But to your point, you're completely correct. He didn't play in meaningful snaps, but he got like a series in that Purdue game, maybe in the third quarter, let's say. And as soon as the ball came out of his hand, it was different. So the abilities there, that doesn't certainly go back into the leadership portion of things and the decision-making process. So, yes, he's at the top of the league. He's the biggest X factor, because it is the big three and it's everything else. Penn State needs to show that they can play winning football against the big team, the two teams down the wire. And, of course, they weren't even Michigan last year. So a lot of pressure on James Franklin to show that he is a championship caliber coach.
Finally, let's ask you about your Buckeyes. Of course, there's a lot of interest over here in what goes on in your neck of the woods as well. What's the big storyline other than the quarterback battle, which, again, I don't really care which one of them wins the job. To me, the bigger challenge is Ryan Day not naming one of these guys the starter so early that the other guy ends up in the transfer portal this summer. Okay, but either one of them is at the very least going to step in. And to me, the floor is like a second team all Big Ten conference quarterback. That's like the floor. So what else are you watching this spring for your Buckeyes?
Yeah, so the two big components there would be offensive line. They lost their best tackles, NFL caliber guys. They lost their Luke Whippler. It was not projected that he was going to make that declaration for the NFL draft. So that was a bit of a surprise and a blow to the offensive line. So they got to find a center. They haven't had the haul of offensive linemen or the transfer portal overall like Michigan has. They did bring in a guard from Louisiana. It's well accomplished, but he's probably a guard. So the guard position was the issue last year for Ohio State, and potentially it could be the tackle position, which is a whole other level of issue for Ohio State this season. And again, we could point to the entire defense, although the linebacking position is rock solid for the first time in a long time, and the defensive line brings back a talent, even though they've underachieved. So the secondary, I don't know what's happened to recruiting, development, and in the field in that secondary for the last 5 years. It's been outside of the Jeffrey Kuhn-led 2019 group. It's not hit the Urban Meyer Ohio State standards since he.
This week's Twitter poll results, we asked you, what is the biggest storyline you'll be watching during Michigan spring football? Amarion Walker's move to corner just edged out the young wide receivers 44-40 for the top two storylines by far. The competition along the offensive line was a distant third. And who's the third running back? And I had to reach to come up with that one for a fourth choice. I mean, I had to reach to come up with that one to come up with five topics or storylines this spring. Again, so many known commodities returning for the Wolverines because this team is freaking stacked. Which brings us to our feedback of the week. Talking about Michigan basketball and the heave by Hunter Dickinson that may have saved Michigan's season at the end of regulation against Wisconsin. And I'm like, hey, man, Michigan has literally lost this game like 7 times this season. I mean, every close game you can imagine Michigan has lost this year. Eventually get a break. Jeff Humphrey says, if we're still watching them in 2.5 weeks, we will remember Dickinson's heave. Agreed. Michigan is in the NIT. Nobody remembers Dickinson's heave. It's just kind of irrelevant. Michigan makes the NCAA tournament. It's, one of the biggest singular shots around here since Trey Burke's 3 in the Sweet 16 to upset Kansas. I agree. It really comes down to what is the final destination for Michigan season. Now, I've long held this position. You should turn down the NIT bid. No one should play in it. It's Loserville. There is no other major sport in America that has a playoff of the also-rans. I mean, if you don't make the Stanley Cup playoffs, they don't then take the next 4 or 8 teams and you play for the Stanley Coaster, the Stanley Coffee Mug. They don't do that, okay? If you don't make the playoffs in the NFL, you don't play for Vince Lombardi's smoking jacket, all right, in the loser bracket. No other sport does this. You should turn down a bid to the NIT. So here's an idea. Let's not face that. Let's win one of these 2 road games this week at Illinois or Indiana. And probably at that point then punch our ticket because we'd be guaranteed a top 4 spot in the Big Ten tournament. I think if Michigan's playing Saturday in the Big Ten tournament, it will be in the NCAA tournament, which means they won one of these 2 road games to get a double bye. And then they won their first game, or they ended up winning a couple of games on Thursday and Friday to get to Saturday. I think 19 is probably the magic number for the Wolverines, which, hey, given where this team was in the preseason and the amount of talent on this team, this is not where Michigan basketball wants to be for the second year in a row, grinding away to try to eke out an NCAA tournament bid. Also, though, if you look at the metrics in February, Michigan's a top 15 team in the country. So clearly some real development has gone on after a disappointing opening 3 months of the season. Here we are. The stain of that Central Michigan loss. If you go to all the sites that let you punch in, advanced metrics to determine or switch past results to determine how your team could get in the NCAA tournament, if you go to all those sites and just flip Central Michigan from an L to a W, Michigan's in the NCAA tournament in every single one of them. That quad 4 inexcusable loss is what is holding the Wolverines back right now. That's why I think if we win one of these 2 road games here to close out the regular season at Illinois or Indiana, then I think we will cancel that out and go ahead and put ourselves back into the field. If we don't, going to definitely have some work to do in Chicago to make it, as no question about that. So at least we're in this position now, not where we thought we were going to be at the beginning of the year, but we'd also kind of given up hope we were going to be here at all in the middle of the year. So it is what it is. Thankfully, there is Michigan football, which is absolutely stacked and is underway with spring practice and the countdown to a chance to win a 3rd straight, unprecedented, and unshared, undisputed Big Ten championship. That and more coming your way on our very next episode of Michigan Podcast. Don't forget to like, rate, subscribe, share, 5-star review, follow. Help us to find wherever you watch, like here on YouTube, or listen, like here on iTunes. However you watch or listen or access us, help us to find, please, more Michigan fans just like you. And thank you to all of you who have already found us. And please, don't forget to follow us on Twitter in between episodes at Michigan Podcast as well. Until the next time, right here on Michigan Podcast, I'm Steve Dace, and go Blue.